All right. I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible. I'm just going to jump straight to the covenants. So we just have to remember that we're working with the biblical covenants that are given to us in Scripture. I leave out the Noahic covenant because that covers everybody. We're dealing with Israel right now. And these are the three covenants that are at work in all of Old Testament history. Once they come up, then they're at work, and we need to keep them in mind. That God is going to stick with Israel because He's made a covenant promise through Abraham. He has given them a law in order to live by, and if they don't live by it, then we know what's coming because He's told us that disobedience brings curses. And then we also know the Davidic covenant from 1 Samuel 7, that God has made a forever kingdom promise for a son of David, to David, but for a son of David. And so God is, you're going to find that's actually, I'm ruining the story here, but that's the good part of everything that's going on here. The one good thing that keeps happening is not only is God bringing about curses, so He's being faithful to that promise, but He keeps bringing up that I'm going to judge you, but I'm going to not completely wipe you out because of my promise to David. Okay, so God is faithful to His promises, and that's why you have to know the covenants. That's why you got to hold on to the covenants. Plus, they run through this whole thing. When we get to the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, of course, remember, is a transition book from a theocracy where God rules alone to a monarchy where God rules through His kings. The first king was Saul, of course, and he was a disaster. And so when we end 1 Samuel, we're wondering what's going to happen with the kingdom now as with David, and that's really what 2 Samuel's about. It's the rise of David and his family, culminating mainly in the Davidic covenant. But then we see that he is not perfect by any means or stretch of the imagination. He falls terribly. He is not a good father. He has multiple wives. And so God's kingdom program to David, the covenant that He made, He will have to bring as an act of grace, and it will have to come later on in David's family. And so that's how we end. We end with 2 Kings with who is this king to come? Because it's not David. And so Solomon is to come. Could it be Solomon? And so when we come into Kings, we have all this hope because and that just keeps building as we continue into Solomon's reign. You can go to the next one. We remember that the theme of the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, is this section in which Elijah asks of Ahab, and we'll look at this next time, this particular verse, but how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow Him. If Baal or any god, other god is, follow him. And so it's really an account of the kings of Israel who are either going to follow God and His law, and therefore, of course, by the Mosaic covenant, they're going to be blessed, or they're going to follow their own evil hearts against God, and they will be judged for it. Okay, so that's what's going to go throughout this whole thing. And really, the outline is really 2 points, 3 points. I think I have 2 points in the kids, but 3 points here. You have the United Kingdom under Solomon, which will end today in chapter 11. And then we work ourselves into the divided kingdom, which is most of the book of Kings. And then at the very end, we have Judah falling into exile, which is exactly what God said would happen if they don't follow Him. Just a review into how we got then down to 1 Kings 11. There's lots of really great stuff going on and gets you really excited about the kingdom. Solomon is going to become king. His brother tried to take it. That didn't work out. But David anoints him, and now Solomon spends time establishing his kingdom. A few people need to be taken out, and they are. And by the end of chapter 2, you have Solomon, who is on the throne, and now he's going to run some things. God appears to him in chapter 3 and asks him what he wants. He'll give him anything in his kingdom, and he says, I want wisdom. It's exactly what God gives him. And so we then see over the next chapter or so, chapter and a half, Solomon's wisdom displayed in both personal matters, but also in kingdom matters, and that comes up to play, especially in the temple. Yes?
In Proverbs it says, the fear of the Lord is wisdom, but like for a lot of Solomon's life, he doesn't fear the Lord, so is he actually wise?
Well, we'll get to that. That is important. That's going to come up here in chapter 11. Yeah, he was a smart dude up front. And obviously he's wise. And then when it comes to the temple building, so remember God told David that his son, in this case Solomon, was going to build the temple, and that's exactly what happens in chapters 5 through 8. You have a whole building. You have the building preparation, you have building the temple, you have even Solomon's palace being built, you have the furnishing of the temple, of all the stuff that's inside of there, and then you have a dedication of the temple in chapter 8. And it's all done for God's glory. It's all meant to be awe. It's not a huge building, but it is very, very tall to get the sense of awe-ness. Of course, only the priests work in the temple, and the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies once a year. And then chapters 9 and 10, Yahweh comes to Solomon one more time and reminds him, this is the fourth time in these narratives, he reminds him one more time that if you follow me, then he just repeats the Mosaic covenant. If you follow me, then you won't have any problems. Everything will go smoothly, you'll have a great kingdom, and you won't be cut off from the land. But if you don't, then I will cut you off, and the temple will become a byword among the nations, meaning it will just be like, look, they don't care about their God, or their God doesn't do anything. And then chapter 9 and 10 have a bunch of other accomplishments and about Solomon's riches and all that such of what's going on. So it all looks really amazing. Like this looks like, and you could say it is the height of Israel's kingdom in the Old Testament. And yet, when we get to this point, we have all this other stuff that's going on in the rest of the Bible behind it. We should feel a little bit uncomfortable because, number one, Solomon, we know from chapter 3, has already made marriage alliances with foreign nations. And he was still permitting, chapter 3, and he was practicing idolatrous ceremonies. And Deuteronomy 17 warned Israel's king about the accumulation of gold and horses, which is might and luxury. And that's everything that Solomon has. He's gaining women. He's not doing a good job at the idolatrous stuff, and he is accumulating far more wealth than he probably should. And so when we come to this point, we got the Mosaic covenant in our head, specifically Deuteronomy 17, to be like, I think something wrong is going to happen here. But Solomon's reign is magnificent, but it really is just a temporary apex. It's a foretaste, honestly, of what the Davidic kingdom will be, and it has to point, as we see today, to something far greater that is to come. And this brings us to now the mud, the junk, the bad of the beginning of it, that is. And really I was trying to find a way to describe what's going to happen over the rest of the book of Kings, and a spiral downward is basically the best I could do. Because from Solomon and all the other kings, all the way to 586 BC when Judah goes into exile, it's just a downward spiral. Even when we have good kings, you end up with evil kings on their backside. Or if you have good kings back to back, they end up being evil at the end of their lives. So you can't get like any momentum going at any point, anywhere in the kingdom. Even though you have a few that are like, oh, okay, Hezekiah, oh, Josiah, like, okay, we're getting, and then one generation later, boom, back down in the tank. And so this is the way to explain what goes on here. So we need to look at it, but that's what's coming. All right, chapter 11. Solomon's reign ends, I will call, in shame, like the cone of shame, or the emotion shame. I don't know. All right, let me read the account, because when we read this here, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 8, the feeling that should come with this, or at least does for me, is every sentence is like, stop. Like, stop what you're doing. No more. And it just, stop, stop. And it just piles on so badly that you're like, this is the worst thing ever. So follow along. Chapter 11. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the sons of Israel, in case you forgot that this was said, you get it here, You shall not go along with them, nor shall they go along with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. And this is important. Solomon clung to these in love. So it wasn't just like a little, just like he did it occasionally or maybe kind of indulged in it. This was, he clung to them. Verse 3, I don't even know how this is possible, but he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And what did his wives do? His wives turned his heart away. It's exactly what God said would happen. Now, it happened at that time that Solomon was old. His wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his father had been, which is a really interesting comment because we know about David's life. We know about the screw-ups of his life. But this text is telling us that David's heart was fully committed to God, even though he was a mess. Okay? Verse 5. For Solomon went after Asheroth, the god of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and did not follow Yahweh fully as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus he did for all of his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed their gods. So, we know what the Mosaic Covenant says, and this is not going to go well. You know, it's possible that he did all this because it all stems from pride, but the point is Solomon loved the pleasure of this world over obedience to God. And that's an application point right off the top, because that is us as well. And this becomes a helpful definition of sin. Loving the pleasures of the world over obedience to God. Believing or living that God's promises, in this case the Mosaic Covenant, that God's promises are not real, nor are they satisfying. Whereas my finite mind, my experiences, my feelings, my understandings are better than God's way. But temporary pleasures always kill. They're good in the moment, but in the long run, they will destroy you. And I don't believe, by the way, that this all happened in one day or in a week. Solomon didn't, he wasn't writing 1,000 hymns on Monday, and then by Friday he had 1,000 or 100 or 1,000 women. Okay? Sin and walking unfaithfully comes in slow, small decisions, small compromises, things that nobody else sees but yourself initially. Or they get blamed as, well, the culture does this. Or in his case, in order to make this alliance, I've got to marry this wife. Compromises. And my personal experience attests to this. I have decisions earlier in my life, namely as a teenager, in which I deeply regret, and I'm very thankful for God's grace and forgiveness. But as I evaluate them now, as I look back, they always started small. They always started just with me and my eyes and my heart. And those little things, and that they never got taken care of and were never repented of, they always then led me to the big nasties. And then I wonder how I got there. But the only way you get there is because you made all these decisions that got you there. Okay? And I think that's what happened with Solomon. He reminds me, been in youth ministry a long time. It reminds me of youth who come across as godly, and I can think of a couple who led music for the youth group. They led Bible studies. They seem like a teen on fire for the Lord. And yet 10 years after they graduate, they have nothing to do with the church. They have nothing to do with Christians. They're successful in whatever they're doing, but God doesn't mean anything. But that's because little choices over time led them beyond where they originally were. Whether they're believers or not is another discussion. But the point is, all that happens through small compromises. Desiring the things of the world over God's things. It doesn't matter how small the decision is. Desiring your things over God's things. Choosing to believe that your way is better rather than God's way. Desiring the approval of men and not God. Serving your pride and not serving God. That's how Solomon got here. And at any point, Solomon could have turned in repentance and received forgiveness, and it would have been granted. But he just keeps getting deeper and compromising more and compromising more and compromising more. And now he has 700 wives and 300 concubines that are all turning his heart away from the Lord. He needed to repent. And that's true for us still. Repent. Get right with God. You're only one step away from being back in right relationship, no matter how far you have wandered. But keep in mind that the farther you wander away from God, the more you will regret how much you've piled up when you do come to God. And the more you see how unfulfilling all of your selfish desires are. Because remember, sin only brings death. Okay? And even by the time we get to the end of his life, and we get the book of Ecclesiastes, which I'll come back to in a minute, you get to Ecclesiastes, you see that everything that Solomon had lived for at this point, he says, is like sandcastles, soap bubbles. It means nothing. Whatever you're pursuing that you think is going to fulfill you, that is not God, is a soap bubble. It will not fulfill you. It is worthless. It is useless. And Solomon is a great example of that. He had everything. Everything you want, he had 10,000 times over. And it will not fulfill. It'll only bring death. Don't be fooled by sin's deceitfulness. And by the way, in verse 7, just for a moment, just to show you how far he went. In verse 7, Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, and Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon, these two particular idols demanded some of the most vile, immoral practices, including child sacrifice to these gods. And yet Solomon made, verse 8, provision for all of his wives to do this. In other words, he gave up his own children to idols that they would be killed to worship these idols. It's horrifying, but that's what he did. That's how far he got. Now, how does God react? How do you expect God to react? God's angry, right? And he should be. Look at verse 9. Now Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not walk after other gods. But he did not keep what Yahweh had commanded. So Yahweh said to Solomon, because this has happened with you, you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you. So I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days. Why? For the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Because Solomon loved his sin and clung to sinful desires, he poisoned his own soul, and God is now going to bring punishment. No more kingdom. Solomon is going to lose it, not in his lifetime, but it's going to reach beyond his lifetime. Remember, as we've seen all the way back into 1 Samuel, sin always has further reaching consequences than we think. It's never one-to-one. It's one to very large one. It's always worse. The kingdom will divide. And yet God still has grace because he's faithful. And that's, for the sake of your father, he's not going to get rid of it in his day. In verse 13, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give it to one tribe, to your son, for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, whom I have chosen. God will spare the kingdom because of because of David, because of his promise to David. He made a promise to David and to Israel, and this will be the place where God is exalted, Israel. As I said in my Kingdom of God series we did at Christmas time, God's plan is to make Israel the beachhead of God's blessing to the world. That's this verse. Another example of that will continue. Now, one of the covenant curses that comes, that is back in the Mosaic covenant, is if you follow God, you will have peace in a military way. You won't have war. But if you disobey, war will consume you. And guess what immediately happens? In verse 14, look at it. Then God raised up an adversary right away, an adversary. And then in verse 23, we're going to see another adversary. And then in verse 26, another adversary. So he's going to give it triple. God brings about three enemies: Hadad, Rezin, and Jeroboam. Hadad, in verses 14 to 22, is an Edomite. It explains here that he had a past beef with Joab, who remember was David's commander. Hadad fled to Egypt, but now that Joab and David are gone, he is now returned, and he is going to create problems for David's son. And that's all we get there. He's an adversary now on that angle. We also find out about, in verse 23, Rezin from the north. He was simply just a thorn in the side of Solomon's reign during, particularly the second half, because we know from chapter 4 in 1 Kings that the early part of Solomon's reign was peace. So this would come later in his reign. And then we come to the name Jeroboam. Jeroboam was an Ephraimite, and he was one of Solomon's servants, some kind of a house slave. Now Ephraim, who remembers where Ephraim, what is an Ephraimite? I'll ask a real question. What's an Ephraimite? From the tribe of Ephraim, okay. And where does the tribe Ephraim come from? Yep. What family do they come from? Like what? What's that? Joseph, that's right. Joseph had two sons. What was the name of the other one? Manasseh. So do I have a map? Somewhere? Hey, cool, look at that. So when they split up all the land in Joshua, the two sons of Joseph got Ephraim, and then Manasseh was split up, okay? So the two sons got Joseph's inheritance, which ended up being those pieces, okay? Jeroboam was one of the descendants of the sons of Joseph, in this case, Ephraim. And Jeroboam was a soldier, it tells us here, but he was also appointed to the north by Solomon, so he wasn't a house slave, I said that wrong. He was appointed as a servant for the kingdom up in the north in order to take care of all the forced labor that was going on in the north. So he was a trusted guy, he had a lot of people he worked with, and so Solomon trusted him. And what happens in this narrative here from verse 26 down is that a prophet, Ahijah, a real prophet, comes to Jeroboam and lets him know that Solomon is going to be judged, the kingdom is going to be split, and you, Jeroboam, are going to inherit the 10 tribes to the north. And again, it's because Solomon, the nation, have all worshipped false gods. That's 29 through 33. And yet he also tells him that Yahweh is not going to take away Judah, which includes Benjamin, so it's Benjamin and all of Judah. He's not going to take all that away because he made a covenant promise to David. There it is again. It's found right here, once again, in verses 32 to 34. Because of David. So God is going to make Jeroboam the king of the 10 northern tribes, and he's going to call him Israel. And Solomon's kingdom will be Judah and Benjamin in the south, and they will be called Judah. And yet we also find out, if you look down at verse 39, just for a moment, it's a real quick verse. It says, "Thus I will afflict the seed of David for this, and this is key, but not always. So they will not always be divided forever. There will come a time where they're united again. So again, we have a difficult problem for those who reject that Israel has a plan in the land of Israel. Because right here, he says that they will be divided, but they will not always be divided, but united back together as one people in the land. That's the Davidic covenant. Again, the reuniting of Israel back into their land. Interestingly, in verse 38, Ahijah, the prophet, informs Jeroboam that if he is obedient to Yahweh, if Jeroboam is, then God will give him an enduring house. It sounds very similar to what he says to David, but he said, I will build you an enduring house. It's actually similar to what he also said to Saul, remember? He said, if you do this, I will give you a perpetual house. I'll give you a forever house if you follow Yahweh. So verse 40, Solomon sought therefore to put Jeroboam to death because he found out. So Solomon finds out this prophet went up there, and Solomon's like, we got to go kill Jeroboam. Jeroboam flees to Egypt until Solomon dies. That's the end of chapter 11. So Solomon is now dead. Jeroboam, we know, is going to take over the top 10 tribes. We still have the bottom tribes, but that means one of the sons of Solomon is going to have to take over those. This is already beginning to be a mess, but there's already going to be a divide. Now, Solomon, just very briefly, and you can do your own reading on this. Maybe you already have. It says right here in 1 Kings 40, the rest of the acts of Solomon and whatever he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? And that's a really important phrase, because even though Solomon struggled at the end of his life, quite obviously in the book that we're given here, we are left his wisdom. And that wisdom includes what books? Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and some of the Psalms. Okay? It's particularly important, Ecclesiastes, because I believe Ecclesiastes is Solomon's repentance. Okay, again, you can go look at it on your own. You can figure that out. But I believe Ecclesiastes is the end of Solomon's life, reflecting over the worthless pursuits of what he did, and landing at the end of that book with God's way is the right way, always. And I should have done that. And so whether he was saved early in his life and just sort of pretending, and then he went through a mess, and then God redeemed him at the end, or he wasn't saved and then he was saved, I'm not sure. I can't answer that. But this is what was left over. Okay? His life ended very badly, and in a sense there was no way to reverse all the stuff that he did. But he could repent. And by the way, 2 Chronicles 9, none of chapter 11 of 1 Kings is mentioned. None of it. It's he built the temple and then he dies. And the same thing happened with David. David does all this great stuff and then he dies. We don't get anything about any of the evil stuff he did from 2 Samuel. And the point there is to say that these men ended right with God, even if a large portion of their life was unfaithful. And we can point those out, and God puts them in here to remind us of that. We don't want to be that way, but they got themselves into a position later in life where they couldn't reverse everything, but they could get right with God. And that's, I think, the point of this just being here. We are given his wisdom, and we need to listen to it. All right, chapter 12. Let's move a little quicker now. Chapter 12 begins tracing the divided kingdom. What date are we on here? What date did Solomon die? This was last week's quiz. What year in BC did Solomon die? 931, okay? 931, that's when he dies, and so that's when this all starts to shift, okay? And we start with Rehoboam. Rehoboam, his foolish choices are going to lead to this split. So this is how providentially the kingdom is going to split. After Solomon's death, Rehoboam comes to Shechem, and Shechem is up in the territory of Ephraim, where all Israel gathers and makes him the king. That's verse 1. And remember, Jeroboam had fled off to Egypt, but for some reason, Rehoboam just gets up in there. He gets made king real fast. But Jeroboam, not really trying to fight it, but he just returns from Egypt. Remember, he was in charge of all the forced labor up in the north. And he asks Rehoboam to lighten the heavy burden, the labor and the tax burden that Solomon had imposed. Rehoboam wisely seeks counsel from the older men, the elders, who had served Solomon, and they urge him in verses 6 and 7 to rule with kindness, to lighten the load, to be softer on the people a little bit, to serve as a servant. That was wisdom, seeking them out. Unfortunately, unwisely, he rejects the older men's wisdom and follows the advice of his own peers, who essentially tell him that if Rehoboam is kind-hearted and a servant to the people, then he's not a man. It's not the first time that threat's ever been used. You're not really a man if XYZ. Man up, be hard, instead of being kind. Rule with harshness, or people will not respect you, essentially. So pride led the way, and Rehoboam comes before the people, and he responds harshly, and he threatens them to increase. Look at verse 14. He spoke to them, this is chapter 12, according to the counsel of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, and I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." It's hard. It's harsh. It's arrogance. And this decision is what then provokes what God said was going to happen through the prophet Ahijah. And this is going to split the tribes, because by the time you get to even the next couple verses, Israel did not like that, the nation, the 10 tribes, and they just asked the question, then what portion do we have with David if you're going to make it so hard? And so they left. And as a result, you have a split. Rehoboam ruled only Judah and Benjamin, while the rest they all rejected David's house. Rehoboam, in turn, by the way, tries to mount an attack. Okay, well, if you're not going to live under my extreme forced labor, then I'm going to come and attack you and kill you, essentially. God sends another prophet to Rehoboam, Shemaiah, who is a man of God, and he tells him not to fight. Thankfully, Rehoboam listened this time. Civil war is prevented, at least for the time being. So Rehoboam's immaturity, his pride, his foolishness is what divided the kingdom. And yet, verse 15 still sits here. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from Yahweh that he would establish his word. Okay? So God is still in total control of what's going on. And we get a wonderful example of both sovereign control over the kings and human responsibility, because this is punishment and decisions that are being made by humans. Those two things remain at tension all the way throughout the Bible. Is humans are responsible for their sin, but God is sovereign even over those sins, even though he is not responsible, and he will punish those sins. And you have to keep those in constant tension, because the Bible never lets it up or explains it. All right, then we get into down into the second part of, and starting in verse 25, and really from the end of 12 through 14, we have Jeroboam's rebellion. And so now we just focus on Jeroboam for a little while up in the north. And the first thing we see is his sinful choices. So Jeroboam, starting in verse 25, was then made king over the northern tribes, but fearing that the people would still go down to Jerusalem and worship, why is he fearing that? I don't know, but he figures they would turn their hearts back to Rehoboam. He then establishes his own alternative religious system, which, how well do you think that's going to go with God? So verse 28, what he does, he sets up 2 golden calves, one in Bethel in the south. Do I have a map on this? One in Bethel in the south, and one in the north to accommodate everybody. See, accommodating people in their sin is not a new concept, even for religious people, okay? And he told them that these gods that are found in the north and the south represent the gods, plural, who brought them out of Egypt. Remember, only one God did, but we're back to idol worship again. Then he appointed non-Levitical priests. Well, God was very clear about that. Only Levites can serve in the temple. And then he instituted a counterfeit feast to rival Yahweh's worship. So he did everything that you were supposed to do, but did it all wrong. It focused in the wrong direction. Okay? So Bethel in the north, Dan in the south. And this is sarcasm. God was very impressed with the golden calves before, so now he's going to be doubly impressed with 2 golden calves, right? Yeah. So this is not obedience. God would have established Jeroboam's reign if he had continued to worship Yahweh properly. But his fear, his pride led Israel into idolatry. It set a sinful pattern that would plague the northern kingdom from this point all the way throughout. Because every single king from here on out is going to get compared with Jeroboam. Were they as evil as Jeroboam? That's the question throughout the northern kingdom. And you'll see that. I'll show you some of that over and over and over again. And notice in verse 33, the last verse in chapter 12, it says that we went up to the altar, which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month on which he had devised in his own heart. Here is where man-made religion starts. It's devised in their own heart. It's self-worship is what it is. And again, that's the key to the rest of it. Are the kings who follow Jeroboam going to follow their own heart like Jeroboam did? That's the question. Now this leads to chapter 13, where I'll just call it spiritual rebellion. A man of God, this is a very interesting chapter because you get a man of God who comes from Judah. He's not named, he's just called a man of God. But he comes from Judah, sent by Yahweh to confront Jeroboam at this altar that he's at in verse 33 of the last chapter. And Jeroboam is offering sacrifices, and the prophet announces loudly that there's judgment coming. And in order to be a prophet, for the Mosaic covenant, in order to be a prophet, you have to proclaim something that's true, and then you got to give signs to prove that it's true. And he gives 2 signs. The first one is a long-range sign, which is a future son of David, who is named Josiah, would sacrifice priests on the high places and human bones on the same altar that Jeroboam was at that moment. And that's exactly what would happen about 100 years later. Okay, so this is a 100-year later prophecy that will come about in 2 Kings 23. To prove that prophecy was going to come, there was a short-range prophecy, an immediate fulfillment. The prophet gave a sign that the altar will be split apart and the ashes which are on it will be poured out. Obviously, Jeroboam, as it says in the text, he didn't like this. This was not cool, so he stretched out his hand. He pointed for the guards to go seize that man, and immediately his hand shriveled up into something gross, and I imagine like a mummy or something. And this got the attention of Jeroboam. He pleaded with the prophet and asked God to restore his hand, and God did. And then the man of God left, and we find out that he was told, make sure when you don't stay. Jeroboam wanted to stay for a meal. God told him, don't eat bread, don't drink water, don't return the way you came. Okay? That's what he was told to do, and so he leaves. And as he's on his way, oddly, another, verse 11, old prophet, and we're going to find out this prophet is more like an ex-prophet, okay, he's not a godly man. He lived in Bethel, and he learned of all the events that happened, and he went out to meet the man of God. And the old prophet, again, not a real one, as we'll see in a moment, he invited the man of God to eat, which again, he wasn't supposed to do that. He was told not to go eat and drink and all that. And so the man of God restated he's not allowed to do that. But this old prophet said that an angel came to him and go tell the man of God to come eat and drink. And at this point, the man of God should have inquired of God again. Because he shouldn't be listening to somebody who's, even if it was God, it's a contradiction in terms. And he should have listened to that, but he didn't. He wanted to please God, and so he turned, and we find out in verse 18 that this old prophet was deceiving. He was dealing falsely with the man of God. So they went and they had dinner, and then the man of God left. And then just to remind us that even men of God who work for God in his service are still accountable. Yahweh confronts him, verse 20, on the road for his disobedience. And for his disobedience, God has a lion come and kill him, but not maul him. The lion just ends up standing over the body of this man of God, and the donkey stands right there as well, which the donkey would also be dead from the lion. But they're just standing there. Some people were passing by. They saw that the man of God's body, and the lion standing over top of it, and the donkey just chilling by the side of the road next to all this. That got reported back to the old prophet, and he commanded that the man of God's body be buried into his own tomb, and that his sons one day would bury his own body in the same tomb. It's weird, but the narrative finishes with how Jeroboam reacted to the man of God's word. And here it is again. Look at the very end of this chapter, verse 33. After this event, Jeroboam did not return from his evil way. So Jeroboam didn't take any of this, even the grace of God to get his hand back immediately. He didn't take any of that. He continued to do evil. But this chapter points out that both evil men, wickedly evil men, and God's people are accountable to God. Okay? Especially people who serve him in a position like mine, doubly in some ways, more important, judged more harshly, if you want to use James 3 term, because you represent God. And that's exactly what we get here. Prophets need to maintain their integrity as well. Just because you're in his service doesn't mean you are above obedience. You need to be obedient. Okay? Chapter 14. Moving right along. Now we have the consequences that come to Jeroboam for his disobedience. So Jeroboam sends his wife in disguise to the prophet Ahijah to inquire about their son who is now sick. So our son is sick. Go dress yourself up. Don't look like a queen, and go and find out if you can get something good out of the prophet. And at this point, the prophet is blind. Ahijah is blind. He can't see anything, but he still is talking with God. And so Yahweh comes and tells him that she's on her way, and here's what you need to tell her. And before she can even say anything, she comes in, and he's like, "Hey, wife of Jeroboam, let me tell you something." She didn't get a word out. And Ahijah gives a devastating prophecy. Jeroboam's dynasty will be cut off, his household will perish violently, and Israel, the northern tribes, will ultimately be uprooted and scattered because of the sins of idolatry that he introduced. So again, sin has farther-reaching results and effects than you ever realize. His wife never gets a word in. She leaves. The sign that this was going to be true was their son was going to die the moment she walks back into the city. They were living in Tirzah at the time, and that's exactly what happens. She comes back home where they live. As soon as she returns home, their child dies. So God's judgment is coming. This is the consequence for his disobedience. And then Jeroboam dies. We now go to the south, down into Rehoboam's reign. And I'm already giving away what kind of king he is. But in the south, we see that under Rehoboam, Judah falls, the nation of Judah falls into spiritual decline, more idolatry, sexual immorality, especially male prostitution, and it provokes Yahweh to jealousy. These are my people, and I'm not going to let you get away with sin. So verse 22 of chapter 14, and Judah did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and they provoked him to jealousy more, this is an interesting note, more than all their fathers had done with the sins which they had sinned. All that their fathers had done. So you got to think back into that first generation that came out of Egypt. You got to think the Judges period. What these guys did under Rehoboam is worse than all of that. It has to be pretty bad. Wow. And as divine discipline, the Egyptian king invades Jerusalem. So God uses nations to punish his people. Even though they're evil, he still uses evil nations to punish his people. We know that all the way back into Judges, but we see it again here. That's going to prove again later on with Assyria and Babylon in their exile. They plunder the temple and the royal palace. They take apparently all these Solomon shields that were up that were made of gold. They stole all of those. And Rehoboam decides that, we need to put something in their place. And so he makes a bunch of bronze shields, puts them up, and has them brought in every night so they can't be stolen again. But bronze is way less valuable than gold is. But this is just a symbol of the diminished glory that's beginning to happen in Judah. The chapter closes of chapter 14 emphasizing that both kingdoms, Israel and Judah, are experiencing the consequences of the Mosaic covenant. Their unfaithfulness brings God's judgment, and they are at war with each other. That's crazy. Israel as a nation, both of them are supposed to be united in two purposes, really. One, to be holy before their God, and then secondly, to be a blessing to the nations. And here we find out, one generation removed, two with David, but one with Solomon, that they are filled with immorality, and they are at war with one another, and the other nations are taking advantage of them. It's a mess, just off the top, but it reminds us again, God takes his promises seriously. If he says he's going to curse, he will curse. And that then takes us to chapter 15 and 16. In chapter 15 and 16, we get two Judah kings and 5 Israel kings. So now we're going to start getting into sort of the king round here, and you got to be able to track with some of these a little bit. But we're going to start working down all the kings throughout the rest of the time in the book of Kings. The 2 kings of Judah, remember Judah's in the south, is Abijam. In some translations, it's Abijah. There's a textual critical thing that's going on there that we don't need to get into because it's not very fun. But anyway, we have the name here, and then Asa. I'm going to call him Abijam at the moment. And he was an evil king. So he comes after his dad Rehoboam. He reigns briefly, and we don't get a lot about him, other than that he followed the sinful patterns of his dad. But verse 4 and 5, for David's sake, Yahweh would give him the lamp in Jerusalem and raise up a son after him and establish Jerusalem. Because David did what was right in the sight of Yahweh and had not turned aside from anything he commanded him all the day of his life, except for the case of Uriah the Hittite, which is kind of interesting. He mentions the only problem that he actually had was a whole situation surrounding Uriah the Hittite, which was the beginning of that problem. Other than that, David was committed to God. And so because of the Davidic covenant, God is going to continue to maintain, and he doesn't need to keep saying this, but he says it up front here, he's going to continue to maintain these kings in Judah, no matter how evil they are, because of his promise to David. So God is very good on his promise to curse. He's also good on his promise to bring about his kingdom, which he said he would. We then go to his son Asa, and Asa was a pretty good king. He succeeds his dad Abijam and stands out as a pretty faithful king. He removes idols. He has to, this is awkward, he has to depose his idolatrous grandmother. How would you like to confront your grandma on her idolatrous practices? But he had to do that, and he got rid of her royal position so she would quit influencing people. And I don't know, he puts her in jail. I don't know what he did. And calls the nation back to covenant loyalty. So he does good stuff initially, really good stuff. And yet, the problem is, by the time you get further down into his story, he compromises on some political alliance with Syria rather than trusting Yahweh. And so he is good in total. He had this one problem where he kind of leaned into alliances and he shouldn't have. And that's the one problem he has. Other than that, he is a good king. So that's the 2 kings of Judah. We then come into the 5 kings of Israel, beginning with Nadab. And all we know about Nadab, beginning in verse 25 of chapter 15, is that he was evil and that he killed Baasha. That's all we know, okay? And he was killed by Baasha, excuse me. He was evil and then he was murdered. That's all we know. Verse 26, he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and he walked in the way of his father and in the sin in which he made Israel sin. So, again, he walked according to his father. His father would have been Jeroboam. Okay? And again, everybody's going to get compared to that in the northern kingdom. How was he like compared to Jeroboam? In this case, he walked in the same sin. And that's all we know about this guy. How would you like your whole life to be one thing? This guy was a sinner, and then he was murdered. And that's all you know about him. It's terrible. Well, Baasha comes up next. What a name, Baasha, the end of chapter 15. Baasha comes up, and after he killed Nadab, then he went and murdered the rest of the family of Joab. And again, that fulfills a promise that, remember, the prophet made to Jeroboam back in chapter 14. So that's done. And then he warred with Asa down in Judah. So there's that civil war stuff happening. And then look at verse 34 of the end of chapter 15. And he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and walked in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he made Israel sin. So there it is again. How is he compared to Jeroboam? He walked in the same way as Jeroboam, even though in this case he's not related. Chapter 16, verses down into verse 1 through 4. God sends a prophet, Jehu, to Baasha and tells him that because of what he did to Jeroboam's family, God is going to do the same thing to Baasha's family. All of his family are going to die because of his rebellion. And then that just sits there. And we move on to the next king, Elah. And he became king over Israel in the city of Tirzah, and he reigned for 2 years. He was the son of Baasha, and he was killed, this is all we know, he was killed by his commander after he had a drunken party up on his own in his palace. And then Zimri, who's the guy who was commander, went and killed all of Elah, he went and then killed all of Baasha's family. And that fulfills Jehu's prophecy. So things aren't looking good. Nadab, Baasha, Elah, and now we're on to Zimri. Zimri has the shortest reign of all the kings. His reign lasted all of 7 days. Because the people, remember he's the commander of the army, the people found out that what he did to Baasha's family, and they didn't like it, and so they all made Omri king. And he was also a commander in the Israelite army. And Zimri feared this so much that he killed himself, committed suicide, and he did it by going to the king's house in Tirzah and burned the house down with himself inside. 7 days. And then we get to the last one, Omri. Omri moved into the capital. He moved the capital from Tirzah to Samaria, probably because Zimri had just burned it down in his suicide. But he was, according to the text, an evil man again. And he acted, verse 25, more wickedly than all who were before him. Verse 26, for he walked in all the way of Jeroboam. So there it is again, just over and over and over again, this same sign. And it angered Yahweh. And then he died. And then we get into Ahab, which we're not going to get into